My name is Sommer Bazuro. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for the FCBHEALTH network of agencies. Our guest today is Dr. Joseph Unger. Thank you so much, Dr. Unger, for taking the time to speak with us today. What are the barriers that contribute to racial disparities in clinical trials?
In my view, the biggest barriers are structural and clinical, rather than at the level of the physician and the patient. Structural barriers represent the challenge of simply conducting a trial. For more than half of patients, a trial is simply not available where they receive their care. Clinical barriers pertain to whether patients are actually eligible for a trial if one is available. And another quarter of patients are not eligible for trials, even if one is available. So you can see that if you sum that up, for more than 3 out of 4 cancer patients, there's not even a chance for them to have a conversation with their physician about participating in a trial. When patients are actually offered a trial, my colleagues and I separately showed that Black, Hispanic, and Asian patients agree to do so at least as often as white patients. So it's not, the barrier is not really at the patient level as much as we think it is. It really is those structural and clinical barriers which likely contribute to racial disparities, especially as it pertains to where trials are conducted and who has access to those trials.
I'm glad you're starting to talk about some of the misconceptions. Before we go a little further, how can some of these barriers be addressed?
So my colleagues and I have also shown that trials conducted by federally funded research groups enroll more than 3 times as many Black patients as the pharmaceutical company-sponsored trials that lead to FDA new drug approvals. And this is likely because the National Cancer Institute really does take seriously its efforts to conduct trials in the community, at minority and underserved sites. And it has an entire program that is oriented around providing access to clinical trials for patients at these community sites, which helps alleviate those structural barriers that I mentioned. The NCI's federally sponsored network groups represent a ready model for recruitment of diverse populations that is needed.
You're really getting at the heart of some of the misconceptions here. What do you feel, Dr. Unger, are the biggest misconceptions about representation in clinical trials?
The biggest misconception is about patient willingness to contribute to clinical research, in my view. So when you actually offer a patient access to a trial, they agree to participate more than half the time. We found that when you offer patients access to clinical trials, Black, Asian, and Hispanic patients agree to do so at rates that are at least as high as white patients. So this finding is also quite revealing, and it upsets, again, the conventional wisdom, and it suggests that it really is at the level of structural and clinical barriers where disparities by race and ethnicity occur rather than at the patient level. And it also suggests that perhaps the best way to improve enrollment for all patients is to simply better ensure that they're actually offered an opportunity to participate.
I certainly hear it repeated back a lot. So it's good that we have concrete data to show that if in fact, when these patients are asked, they will participate in clinical trials.
In your opinion, what are the barriers that contribute to racial disparities in clinical trials?
You mentioned the structural barriers, and that's certainly the case. Simple access, where patients of color might be seeking their care, they may not have clinical access to clinical trials. There is also the trial design. So inclusion and exclusion criteria within trials might exclude patients with certain comorbidities. These patients might tend to be those patients of color. So that's a factor as well. There's also implicit bias with people who are running the trials. They may make assumptions that their patient population may not want to participate in a trial. You mentioned that that's a huge misconception that patients of color may not want to do it. There's language and cultural barriers. People need to be approached in a culturally sensitive manner. People want to speak to physicians who speak their language. That may be a barrier as well.
I completely agree with what you said. I think that's very interesting. Actually, there is a lot of work being done right now by collaboration among the American Society for Clinical Oncology, Friends of Cancer Research, and the FDA to modernize clinical trial eligibility criteria. And hopefully that will lessen those sort of clinical disparities that you mentioned. I also would remark that the implicit bias that you mentioned, there's a colleague of mine who refers to that as benevolent bias. It's not poorly intended, but it's a bias in any event. And it sort of aligns with the findings that we have, that if you can overcome that bias and you actually offer patients the opportunity to participate, they're much more willing to participate across racial and demographic categories. And so I think that's really critical. One thing that strikes me is that there is this tension between wanting to get a drug approval as quickly as possible versus ensuring representative enrollment. And one thing that has become apparent in my research as well is that pharma doesn't necessarily always enroll patients just from the US. And so part of the reason that representation of Black patients in pharma-sponsored trials is partly because of that. They enroll abroad. It raises a kind of a sticky question, like, is that appropriate, for the FDA to be, should there be a greater emphasis on domestic enrollment?
I think so. I certainly think there should be greater enrollment focused here within the U.S. to be representative overall. You have the overall population within the United States, and then you have the population that's representative of the particular tumor type. We launched our campaign at the tail end of 2020 because the world finally saw coming together a nexus of social justice and healthcare issues that the pandemic brought us. Everything was on full display. And we feel that there is no time like the present to address disparities in healthcare. Thank you so much, Dr. Unger, for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you to our viewers out there. Like and subscribe to our channel. Watch for the next session coming soon. Demand change, take action, sign the petition. Let's not wait to save lives from cancer. Join us. Visit ClinicalEquality.com.